It's an honor to welcome Secretary of Education Arne Duncan to the University of Michigan. Mr. Secretary, your visit coincides with the first week of classes, and there is a palpable energy across the entire campus. And the Notre Dame game is still 2 days away. The enthusiasm is particularly strong here at the School of Education, where the students and faculty have a deep commitment to transforming teacher education. And we have a dean who is an absolute fireball. She's worked in the classroom, she knows the challenges, and she is a national force in how we as a nation train our teachers. I can guarantee a spirited discussion later in the program. As a university, we are proud to help lead in changing the ways teachers are prepared for practice, because few professions are more critical to the well-being of our country. I am most certainly preaching to the choir here, but the message cannot be overemphasized. Quality education is absolutely essential to national success. It's simple, but it's extremely complicated. Our achievements as individuals, as states, and as a nation, our achievements are rooted in robust classrooms, quality teachers, and strong, equitable public policy. We teach and research all of these factors and more. As a university, we strive to develop the finest teachers for tomorrow, as well as work with educators already in the classroom. We work to understand how students learn and how to evaluate academic achievement. And we always look for partners from other disciplines across campus to schools in Detroit, Ypsilanti, and here in Ann Arbor. The work is simply too big, too complex to go it alone. Mr. Secretary, I know that both of your parents were educators. I can say the same for my mother and father, and I know how their values shaped my development. I also know how dedicated they were to their students and the success of those students. That dedication, that desire to make a difference lives here in our students, faculty, and staff. We share your commitment as the country's chief educator, and we are thrilled that you are with us today. We look forward to your message. Thank you so much.
Good morning. I'm Deborah Ball, the Dean of the School of Education here at the University of Michigan, and I thank you so much, President Coleman, for being here to welcome the Secretary of Education. I'm thrilled that all of you are here today. It's really fitting for us to have packed the house here, and I know there are people in overflow spots around the building, because as a professional school in a public research university, we have here taken very seriously our commitment and our mission to be doing the best research and training the best professionals who can go out and contribute to contributing to their solution of the most important problems in educational practice. That is our point of being here. And so having you visit us is an affirmation of something we've committed ourselves to do, to break the mold on what schools of ed should be doing and figure out how to use the resources of this great public research university toward the ends that I know you and I have talked about doing, which have to do with US education, no small thing. So we talked about how to plan this event together in a way that would be as informal as possible. One thing that means is we're going to go by first names. With all the respect that I have for the Secretary, he prefers to be called Arne, and I'm going to be calling him Arne, but it also means that I'm not going to call David Cohen Professor Cohen. So we'll be going by first names. And we've designed the first part of the event to engage as much as we can together, those of us who are on the stage, in a conversation about a few rather pressing issues in education. And after we do that for a little bit, kind of bantering back and forth on a few key problems, then we'll open it up and give you an opportunity to pose questions to us. And I will, at that point, also continue to serve as a moderator so that we can try to take up and discuss together some of the key issues that we are here to do. So thank you for coming, and without further ado, we'll get started. I do want to start by just making a slight more introduction of Arne. Arne Duncan has served as the Secretary of Education since January of 2009, and he's a member, obviously, of President Obama's cabinet. And before that, He served as the Chief Executive Officer of Chicago Public Schools from 2001 to 2008. I'll tell you something else very interesting about him at the end of the session today, so stay tuned for that. Now, I just want to quickly say who's up here on the stage with me. Way on your right is Robert Sellers, who's a professor in the Department of Psychology and also holds a joint appointment in the School of Education. And his work focuses on the role of race-relevant processes on the psychological and educational development of African Americans. Next to Rob is Peter Barr. Peter Barr is a professor of higher education whose work has focused on studying and improving the kinds of experiences that students encounter in community colleges, a very important issue. Right here on my left is Jordan Peschke. Jordan is a senior intern in our elementary teacher education program, and she's focused in particular on developing the capacity to be a very skilled teacher in English and English language arts. On your left and on the right of the secretary is Diedrich Martin. Diedrich is the superintendent of Ypsilanti Public Schools. He's a former teacher and principal in Texas, and he is focused, obviously, given his role, on K-12 educational improvement. Anne-Marie Palinsard, going further down the left, is a professor of literacy, language, and culture here in the School of Education. Her work focuses on the education of teachers and research to improve teaching and learning, particularly at the intersection of science learning and literacy development of young people. Bob Bain is a professor in the School of Education and also in the Department of History, and his work focuses also on the improvement of teachers' capabilities and particularly around the teaching and learning of history and social sciences. And on your far left is David Cohen, who holds a joint appointment in the School of Education and the Ford School of Public Policy. His work focuses on the relationships between what education policymakers try to do and what actually happens in the classroom, a rather important topic as well. A few facts that I think help to shape why this is such a pressing issue for us. One way to put it would be that underserved students in this country are much more likely than any other students to have teachers who are beginning teachers and who are often just grossly underprepared to be teaching them. Another fact about the situation we face is that the demographic of American school children has been changing rapidly. Right now, by some estimates, about 38% of American school children are either African American or Latino, but only 14% of their teachers are minority teachers, so we have a challenge about who it is that goes into teaching. Another thing that's worth understanding is the huge number of new teachers who are entering the system. Something like 1 million new teachers in the next few years are going to be needed. One way to put it would be if you're a child in the United States, you have a 1 in 3 chance of having a teacher who's only been teaching 3 years or less in the classroom. And given the complexity of teaching, that means that your chances that your teacher may not be very skilled yet are pretty high. And one of the things we want to talk about is, can't we do something more about equipping those teachers who have dedicated themselves to working to be more skillful earlier? What would that be like? And I think that's really where I might hand off to you. What would be some of the things we could do so that the risk at which that puts some of our young people, we could start decreasing those risks? What do you think we should be doing?
First, let me say I'm thrilled to be here. I've never been to Ann Arbor before, never been to the University of Michigan. Thanks so much for having us. And you're right, Deborah Ball is just an absolute dynamo. And if I could clone her, I'd retire and go to Bahamas. Our job would be done. And I think the work going on here at this School of Education is phenomenal, not just for the children of this community, this state, but really has national implications. I think you're going to see Deborah playing more and more of a prominent role on the national stage. And we are all in this together. How do we get better? Let me just sort of start with a problem. I meet with, one of the joys of my job is getting to travel, and I've been to 6 states in the past 2 or 3 days on this bus tour. I talk to hundreds and hundreds of great young teachers around the country. And the honest answer is that most of these young teachers don't feel they were prepared coming into the classroom. And if you survey teachers nationally, it's almost 2/3, 62, 65% feel they didn't get a good enough preparation. So I've really tried to challenge schools of ed in the larger community, and some folks have not been thrilled that I've done that. But I think you have an amazing example of doing it right here, and you should be extraordinarily proud of the leadership you're providing. The 2 big things that I hear from great young teachers pretty consistently, urban, rural, suburban, is one, they got lots of theory of education, lots of history of education, lots of philosophy of education, not enough actual teaching kids, not enough actual education. And that, particularly in the diverse communities, diverse environments, walking in there feeling very, very unprepared. So how do we make student teaching not just second semester, senior year, but freshman, sophomore, junior year? How do we really embed that into what schools of ed are doing? Secondly, it's interesting, we've had this huge outgrowth of technology and formative assessments and great work going on where teachers are figuring out in real time not just what they're teaching, but are their students learning and better able to differentiate instruction. And what I hear too often is that young teachers are having to learn this on the job, that they have professors who frankly have been out of the classroom too long. This new technology came in once they were gone, and it's taking great young teachers' craft to a different level, but they're saying, why do I have to learn that on the job? Why aren't I learning that as an undergrad? So those are two very specific things that urban, rural, suburban across the country I hear on a fairly consistent basis.
Well, I'm actually going to ask Jordan, who is in her last year of formal initial preparation, to comment if that's how she sees it. And what do you think you need? I mean, how are you seeing what Arne just said? What are you thinking about?
And Arne, when you're talking about experience, that's exactly what I think brought me into this program and brings young educators from this university into our program. We are in the classroom from the first week we started the School of Ed. We are working with teachers in the field right now and working with professors that have been there recently. And that's the greatest thing about feeling confident and growing as an educator, and now going into my last year in the education program, I feel great about working in the classroom and working with teachers and communicating with educators. And I think that is the greatest asset that this can give us.
Could you give a concrete example of something you feel that you have some at least initial level of skill with at this point? I know you're not done with the program, but what's an example? Because maybe that would make it more concrete for Arne to know, because everybody would say they're out in schools.
Yeah,
so.
I think the biggest thing that I found is we've been talking a lot about management and how you manage a classroom. And that's something that when you sit in a classroom at a university and talk about, you can talk about it forever, and you get in front of kids and it is crazy. It's chaos, it's madness. And you feel like we've gone through all of these methods, we've done all these rehearsing and acting, and it's not doing anything. I still don't know how to do it when I have 25 little faces looking up at me. And so I think that's the greatest thing, is just being in front of kids and having those experiences. And sometimes you bomb and it just doesn't work. And other times it does. And just that growing experience and being in front of kids and really using those management pieces. How am I going to get a kid to look at me who's looking out the window? How am I going to get a whole class to listen while I read a whole story that maybe seems a little long or maybe a little boring to them? And so I think the management piece is figuring out what are those different ways that I'm personally going to do it, which might be different from my classmate. But it's the easiest way to get in front of kids and have those experiences where you might be not doing so great, or you might be, but it's finding that time for yourself and figuring out what works for you.
I don't know, Anne-Marie and Bob, I know both of you work as faculty in the teacher education, but maybe I'll ask Bob, because I know you're heading up the redesign of the way we prepare high school teachers. Now, Jordan is becoming an elementary teacher, but what I was wondering is that what's Jordan learning, and she's elementary, so what are some things that you think that we're trying to do in terms of helping high school teachers be more skilled when they start?
A couple things. So when I was listening to you, Arne, the two things that struck me were the young people you were talking to probably went through a non-systemic system of teacher education. There is not very much systemic about the work that we do. They learn their theory in one place. They learn their content knowledge in another place. They learn to teach in another place. They work with kids in another place. They deal with assessments in another place. When they get out in the field, they get professional development somewhere else. It's almost as if, I mean, we've been using the metaphor, there's a plate tectonics vision of the preparation of teachers. They're in different continents. A quick example of that, I was invited to give a talk at another Big Ten university that I won't mention, to history teachers, but actually to the people that were preparing history teachers. There were historians from this campus, people who had taught them their content. There were teacher educators that taught methods. There were ed psych people. There were teachers that were working with them as mentors. Since I had been trained that way, I thought, you know, this was like almost a family reunion for me, except it was a dysfunctional family reunion. They didn't know each other. And so these were people who had all been involved in the preparation of teachers. So one of the things we're trying to do is change that. So we're trying to build, build bridges across these continents, if you will. I can give you a couple of examples of it. So we offer a very unusual course in the history department before people enter actually their teacher training program, where we unpack, make visible for prospective teachers the ways in which they're being taught history. So they're still getting this large lecture on, in this instance, big history, but then they go to a lab where someone from the School of Education is helping them look at the type of pedagogy that they got. So what they're doing is getting theory, but seeing it in the service of practice. Then when they come here, we focus very much on specific practices. For example, how do you teach a concept? And we rehearse very specific practices. We invite students to take up very specific texts to teach a concept. Then what we do is we work across multiple settings. First, they practice this with their peers, where we role play, in a sense, being an adolescent. Then they work in a small setting, a classroom, where we have a mentor teacher that we've selected and we've picked, who's worked with us, who's actually skilled in teaching text, to work with our students doing exactly the same thing. And then the final thing is that we try to shift then the context within which they practice this. Because even if you student teach in a particular place, but then your first job is in another setting, those experiences may not transfer. So we then try to shift the context, all kinds of things. We move students around from one site to another so that they work with text and teaching big concepts in Detroit, and then we move them to Novi, which is a suburban district. Or then we shift the context. We say things like, so you prepared 2 texts to teach, and you rehearsed it. What if the principal came on and said, your period is shortened, you can only teach 1? Which would you pick and why? So the difference is the focus on the practice, and then also trying to create a system that bridges across the people that are teaching teachers.
Do you have reactions to that, Arne?
I love it. I love it. And it's, again, it's amazing to me how often we've done things a certain way for 10, 20, 30 years, and we haven't adjusted. And to have folks having those conversations, to be much more integrated, to be thinking about this in a much more holistic, comprehensive way, makes absolute sense to me. And again, I just think the model you guys are continuing to establish and reinvent here has extraordinary national implications.
I mean, just if I could say one other thing, one more thing. The other issue is that if we don't do that, then what we're really doing is we're putting the burden on the one least able to connect all these pieces, the novice teacher. And that's essentially been the story of teacher education in this country for, actually, I'd go back longer than 10 years, 150.
Did you want to say something about that? I heard you go, yeah.
I can just understand the feeling, I think.
Anne-Marie, I don't know if you would like to give an example of something specific about elementary.
So given the ridiculously short amount of time that we have to prepare teachers, I mean, it's extraordinary, this profession, that we know enough from lots of studies of expertise that it takes, on average, 6 years to really acquire expertise, and we try to compress that in such a very brief amount of time. So part of the practice that we need to be teaching is how do you continuously improve your own teaching? And this is where technology comes in. In our program, there's ready access to very inexpensive forms of technology so that the moment that our interns are in the field, they're video recording, bringing back practice and examples of what they're doing. It's becoming a very public practice, which again has not historically been characteristic of teacher education. You use the word rehearse. We're doing public rehearsal of challenging teaching, so we can tell the intern, stop, rewind, you need to try that again. And I think that this is probably one of the practices that it's really, I look forward to the payoff for teaching our interns to be able to engage in that kind of self-analysis, critique. And I think we also are trying to encourage our interns to recognize that this best happens when you're part of a community, so that they can go off and reconstitute these kind of communities in their own educational contexts. And I do want to put a plug in for the theoretical and foundational aspects as well, because I think because of the kinds of students with whom our interns are most likely to work, they really do need to understand how opportunity works in this country and how opportunities are foreclosed in very systematic ways to certain students, and what role an educator can play in disrupting that. So basically positioning our teachers as advocates for children. And then second, can I just add
yeah, of
one more piece to that? One more, because then I know I'm going to lose the floor. That is that getting smart about how we help our interns to confront and then overcome prejudices that all of us bring in our interactions with other people who are different linguistically, racially, culturally from the people with whom we've interacted. And learning to confront, face that, and recognize that then you take up the authority to be the educational leader with those youngsters.
All I was going to say, and I think it's interesting, is that on one hand, schools of ed have often, or programs have taught people schools are unequal, racial issues are huge and relational, but they make students end up feeling helpless. Like, it's a big problem, how am I going to do anything about it? So I think one thing we're trying to learn how to do is, how do they learn that to understand these larger issues, but how do you get some skills so you can get some traction on it? Otherwise, all you know is that things are bad, and what can you do? So I don't know if you want to.
Well, on that one, I mean, I say all the time that I just think education is the civil rights issue of our generation, and I feel that unequivocally. And if you can ride in the front of a bus today, but you can't read, you're not free yet, and we have a lot of work to do. And I think the dividing line in our country today is much more around educational opportunity than it is race or class. And give me the poorest child from the toughest community, put them in a great early childhood program, put them in a great elementary school of high expectations, put them in a high school where they can take AP classes and there's a college-going culture. And I'm actually very, very optimistic about that young person's future. But put that child, no early childhood experience, mediocre schools, a dropout factory. Well, we as educators, we're perpetuating poverty and social failure. So to me, it's just this absolute dividing line, and education defines opportunity. So the challenges are real. We have to take them on. It's a struggle. It's a battle. But we are the answer. Education is the key. And so I see it as the civil rights issue of our generation. I see it as the key for our country's economic prosperity. We have to educate our way to a better economy. So the stakes, and again, this is why I appreciate your leadership and the urgency here, the stakes for our country have never been higher. I say I'm not that old. I'm a little bit old now, particularly in college environment. I'm old. But when I was in high school in the South Side of Chicago, my friends could drop out of high school and go work in the stockyards and steel mills and make a pretty good living and own their home and support a family. And those jobs are a distant memory from a bygone era. Every young person in this country has to not just graduate from high school, but go to some form of education beyond that. And we have to dramatically up our game to give our children in our country a chance to compete and be successful.
So, I mean, I think if you broaden a little bit then from the issues of improving the training that teachers get and the support they have to work skillfully, and think more about, given your point that this is the civil rights issue of our time, what are, either from your experience when you were working in Chicago public schools or what you've seen just traveling around, what are a couple of things you think are the highest leverage things to be trying to do? I heard you tell that story about what you did with the AP exam in Chicago, but what do you think are some of the key things to be trying to do to improve kids'
I think in education, as in everything else, talent matters tremendously. And how we get the hardest working, the most committed teachers and principals to the children and communities who need the most help is desperately important, be that inner city, urban, or rural. And I think in so many of our school systems and states and districts, there have been lots of disincentives and almost no incentives to get the folks who had the highest level of skill, highest level of experience, not all the rookies, working with the kids who need the most help, and how we systemically bring in, attract, and retain that talent so that talent doesn't flee, but that becomes the badge of honor to go work in one of these communities. Just one quick example of a district that I think is doing this systemically as well or better than anyone is Charlotte-Mecklenburg, where they're systemically turning around very low-performing schools, identifying their best teachers and principals and putting them in to these communities. And I visited there and talked to a number of the folks, and one of the principals had been a superstar principal in a more affluent community there, amazing results, was going to retire, and then was asked to go work in a very, very tough community in a very tough school. He thought about retiring and decided to do it. And what he said to me was really profound. He said, Arne, this is the most moral and ethical work I've ever done in my career. And I feel so thankful that I had the opportunity. But this had become the badge of honor. And that's what I think we have to systemically do as a country.
Deirdre, I mean, I think these issues all probably tumble around in your work. And from what you've done already in IPSI and what you did earlier, what kinds of things do you think, I mean, do you have comments about what Arne's been saying, or what do you think are crucial things to be turning around chances for kids and having better outcomes?
Absolutely. I think in a lot of cases, if I can jump on to things that have already been said, is when we take and put strong systemic practices in place, you take out the guesswork. So hearkening back to some of my other experiences, when I had new teachers come to my building, you might be new to the profession, you just might be new to my building. You had to understand how we were doing it in my building. So we quickly had extra meeting sessions with the principal on these are the data systems that we're going to use. We're using this to track our kids, and we're going to do it at the very first week of the school year, this, that, and the other. We had extra sessions for these people on, okay, looking at the results from the previous years, these are the teachers who do the best job of classroom management in this particular building. And so I created space and time to have discussions that was framed around theory and pedagogy, but I also created time to release those teachers, have them go in and look at good models of success, and then have those other teachers come back to them to talk about how they would set things up, because you got to have strong core academic skills or pedagogy to be effective as a teacher. But if you cannot relate, connect, and manage that classroom, you're dead in the water before things begin. And so the more we can do things, as you mentioned before, to bring things more in line and systematize the process that we have, the more you're going to end up having high levels of success. And where I see where we typically have failure, particularly in urban areas or where we don't have, where we have a high number of students who are really struggling, you see that teachers are put into situations where the newest teachers get the lowest performing or the toughest kids. And so as a principal, I flipped that on, on its ear day one. We had a way, this is how we're going to determine who's in what class, which teacher will teach which groups of kids, instead of saying, okay, who wants to do tutoring with these kids? I looked at the results and said, okay, Miss such and such, Mr. such and such, Miss such and such, you do a great job in this particular area. I need you to work with this group of kids for this period of time. So it wasn't just, I'm going to pay you to be a tutor because we had Title I money. It's, I need this person to do this specific skills with these group of kids. And so we started to find ways to remove the random act of education and make it more specific and intentional, and that's when you started to see the results.
You have a comment about that? I thought maybe we broaden a little from K-12, just because there are issues both outside of schools that are important for the things for what you said so pointedly before. And Peter, I know you work, you think a lot about community college. I mean, one thing that struck me in reading your work and talking to you is that about half of American young people go through or to community colleges, and sometimes an unattended, I mean, we're sitting here in a four-year institution. Of the things that, that Arne said, and Obama has this college completion agenda, can you make some comments that might be important to add to our conversation?
It's interesting, as a faculty member, as a researcher, you often are focused on little pieces of the puzzle, and this was a great opportunity for me to stand back from my own work and think about some of the larger issues, some of the things that I think are important. And as I thought about that, it occurred to me that in higher education, research in higher education, we tend to focus on the limitations and obstacles to opportunity for underrepresented students, underserved students. And this is a very important line of work, very important questions to ask. When you look at open access colleges and community colleges in particular, in some respects, what you see is a sea of opportunity, but no lighthouse, no landmarks to guide the students. Which is a significant problem, and as a result, we see very low graduation rates in our community colleges, or part of the reason for the low graduation rates. So anyway, in that respect, I see the community college, and I think most people would conceive the community college as being a bastion of student-centered flexibility, but the students who most depend on that flexibility to have any access to post-secondary education are also the students who are least equipped to face the many decision points without assistance, without support, that come with flexibility. So as I thought about this problem and what we could do about this and what we're doing now, what we have now when you look at a typical community college doing, some of the most, in my opinion, some of the most important post-secondary education in the country, in the world, our solution to helping students move through the post-secondary system has been, a 250-page college catalog that you need a college degree to make sense of, and about, on average, roughly about one academic advisor per 1,000 students. In fact, I had an opportunity to talk with one of our large metropolitan, some of the folks there at one of our large metropolitan community colleges here in Detroit, and the person I was speaking with indicated to me that they have one advisor per 5,000 students. So if we expect, we really depend on the community colleges to do some amazing things, do some very important work in this country, to, in my opinion, address in one slice the civil rights issue of our time. However, we need to rethink the way we're helping students move through that post-secondary system. And I think as I considered, what could be better than this, you see it, in fact, all around us. We can take a cue from industry, from the private sector. I bought a laptop computer recently from a major manufacturer, and I didn't need to know what their lines of computers were, and I didn't need to know everything there was to know about this particular manufacturer. I was able to go to their website and click, 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 tell them what size screen I wanted and what speed processor I wanted, and lo and behold, there was my 5 choices to choose from, and price points and so on. And it seems to me that we could do something really similar and in a very cost-effective way with our community colleges today. It would take some work. I mean, we need cooperation and effort at every level of government, but I believe it could be done.
The community college piece is a huge one. I think they've been sort of this unrecognized gem along the education continuum, and whether it's 18-year-olds or 38-year-olds or 58-year-olds going back to retrain and retool and green energy jobs and healthcare jobs and technology jobs, I really think as families get back on their feet, the country's gonna get back on its feet, and community college is gonna be this huge bridge to get there. So we're trying to put unprecedented resources and energy into community colleges. I hired as my undersecretary Martha Cantor, who's an amazing former community college president. First time we've had a community college leader in that role. And we try to do that very intentionally. Coming out soon, later this month, we have $500 million of a $2 billion program with the Department of Labor to partner community colleges with the private sector and their communities, public-private partnerships, to make sure the training there is leading to real jobs. So we're trying to make a massive play there. It's interesting, you have some community colleges today literally open 24 hours a day, 3-4 shifts of students, students going to class at 3 in the morning. And some of my most inspiring visits I go to are community colleges. You see this amazing diversity of backgrounds and age groups, and everyone's there because they're trying to take that next step up the ladder. So whatever your research, whatever your work can do to help us figure out how we get those graduation rates higher, how we make sure that it's not just exposure to some classes, but leading to real skills to lead to real jobs, or as a next step in going on to a 4-year degree, we desperately need to take community colleges to the next level in this country.
Rob, I kind of waited for a while because in some ways the things that you study, which I think are so important, take a larger lens in some ways on the issue, and I wondered if across things that have come up, you might like to point a bit at some things that have really preoccupied you in your work that are important here.
Well, some of the issues, particularly as it relates to providing training for teachers to work with underserved populations, and in particular African American, Latino populations in urban settings, less resource settings, begs the larger question of making sure that not only the students have the skills, the pedagogical skills, but also the experiences and the experiences with these various communities. And the best way to get those experiences with these various communities is often to be from these various communities. And finding ways to provide greater access for students in our underserved school system to universities like the University of Michigan that provides the teaching profession as a potential model, career model, and opportunity to make a difference in their own communities. Because the first thing that one must have in teaching being an effective teacher is a commitment to the students. And seeing the students as yourself as opposed to something different is fundamentally an important piece that I don't think can be taught necessarily in the classroom, but has to be taught through experiences. And some of those experiences is by bringing in people who actually live there, but The other side of that is also making sure that other folks have those experiences. So I can't teach in my classroom what it's like to be African American and what it's like to be in a particular situation via a lecture. On the other hand, if I'm sitting next to a fellow student who has those exact same experiences, and we study together, we do our internship together, we talk after class. Many of those preconceived notions that I have, whether it's the notions that this is a very scary place and therefore I don't want to go there, or that this is a place that I'm going to save and come in as a savior, which then also isn't allowing individuals to relate to the pedagogy. Having greater access at all levels in terms of a diverse student body, a diverse faculty, provides students with, I think, greater training, greater experiences to actually go in the classroom. And that these issues also play out not only within particular classes, but throughout the pedagogy and throughout the training. So, as was mentioned earlier, the integration of skills is important. Well, also the integration of experiences, the integration of seeing diverse children or children from diverse backgrounds as being educable, as being worthwhile, and as being folks for which I have the skills, I have the tools to actually make a difference for them.
Would others like to comment in response to what Rob said?
If I could just quickly add, you started on it and he hit it, I think this idea of how we bring in extraordinary talent from a diversity of backgrounds into education, I can't overemphasize how important that is. And again, frankly, I haven't seen a lot of creativity from many schools of education, but this growing imbalance between what our nation's children look like and what our educators look like is hugely troubling to me. This is not a self-correcting problem. This is getting worse, not better. And making sure we have great talent from the African American Latino community, more men. I always talk about less than 1 in 50 of our, less than 2% of our teachers is an African American male, less than 2% is Latino male, that's 3.5% for the country. And then we wonder why our young boys of color struggle. And we just don't get it. And so whatever we can do to bring in that talent, bring them to an amazing place like the University of Michigan, encourage them to come back and serve their community. We have to be much more creative, much more thoughtful in how we do that. And we cannot close these achievement gaps. We cannot give our children the role models and mentors they need if we don't do some things very, very differently in this area.
So can I just follow up if that's all right? So one of our colleagues here, Rob Jagers, as part of the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context, a quick shout out, has been doing some amazing work with a number of local districts, including developing both an after-school program and a summer program, getting youth from a variety of different backgrounds to the University of Michigan, developing research skills specifically around issues in their own school community so that they see research and they see the University of Michigan and ultimately the School of Ed and education as a potential career choice. I also like to tip my hat to Dean Ball and her initiatives in terms of trying to integrate culturally appropriate teaching practices related to specific pedagogy in terms of various hiring initiatives that are there that we hope will take advantage of in the future.
I think maybe before we open it up to to more people and maybe Henry then too, David, I billed you at the beginning as an expert on studying what educational policymakers try to do and whether it has anything to do with the classroom. And we're sitting around here with the Secretary of Education who wants to make a lot of change. And we're living in some ways, a pretty unprecedented time in some ways. I just wondered if you and Arne might just talk a little bit about what he's up to, how you see these issues at this point, having watched American education reform for a long time and studied it.
Well, pretty much everybody on the panel, including Arne, have said in one way or another that teacher education should be more systemic, less fragmented, and more intensive. The policy and the practice problem is that we live in a country that was very carefully designed to be incoherent politically. And I'm sure that Arne Duncan...
I haven't noticed.
So I think that would be a very good point to open it for questions.
What is your response to that?
Amen. Well, I do, so yeah, there's a whole separate conversation, but I do think in a fragmented, locally controlled, decentralized system, how we get models like University of Michigan School of Education, everybody wants to get better. Nobody wants to do a bad job of teacher preparation. No one wants to perpetuate the achievement gap. And I think there's a greater hunger, there's a greater thirst for getting better than I've seen in a long time. So I'm actually very hopeful. So given those constraints or given that reality, I'm actually still hopeful. And if the question for me is how we replicate those best practices, how we share what's working, the demands are going up. I know Michigan's raising cut scores. So you guys thought you were doing an okay job. Well, it's going to look pretty tough when those cut scores go up. But guess what? For the first time, you're telling the truth. And Mike, I want to thank you for your leadership and the governor for doing that. So achievement gaps that we thought were large are going to look a lot larger with these higher cut scores. And that's the honest truth. So the stakes have never been higher. Folks want to get better. How we better share what's going on. Again, how we give folks like Deborah a much greater voice nationally. That's a lot of what I'm trying to think about. Because no one wants to perpetuate the status quo. Nowhere I go are people saying we're doing it right or doing it well enough. It's how do we get better faster? That's the challenge.
So David, from watching all this, is there anything you'd highlight as would be important to take? Arne's had a message of sort of more hopefulness than I've heard from him in a while all morning today. And I just wonder, in Detroit he sounded more hopeful. What would you, I mean, are there things you would call to all of our attention that would have to be attended to if we were to realize some of the hopefulness he's expressing?
I think Arne is right in saying that there is reason to be more hopeful than ever before. As one of the world's leading pessimists, I feel much more hopeful now than I did 10 years ago about what we can do. And Arne also was right in saying that, or implying that we need to work at 3 levels. One is more systemic approaches to schooling, as with the Common Core, for example, which is a non-governmental effort to build commonality in academic standards. Secondly, we need, as he said, ways to replicate good practice, but that requires system. And we live in a country that hasn't been good at building those systems, has been very good at inhibiting them. Thirdly, we need to develop organizations that have the capability to do the sorts of things that we're trying to do with the Ed School and that the Common Core implies should be done in practice. And that's a huge challenge. I'm very optimistic. For the first time in American history, there are organizations out there that are doing that. Some of the charter networks are building school systems that are, in every sense of the word, educational, not just for kids, but for teachers and for school leaders. Some of the comprehensive school reform designs, the Common Core, America's Choice, Success for All, are operating school systems, some of them larger than the school systems in any single state, that focus on the problems of high poverty schools, and that, like the charter networks, are intensively educational. So if I were king for a day, I would try to imagine and devise ways that we could replicate those charter networks. That's different than charter schools, and some of those comprehensive school reform designs. I think they have enormous promise.
Do you want to respond?
That's the no. I think you hit the crux of the business that we should be in, And I've been, as hard as I'm pushing the country, I've been very critical of our Department of Education historically that's been absolutely compliance focused and bureaucracy focused. The business we should be in is taking the scale best practices and replicating them. And I feel very proud that we helped to contribute to the Common Core movement. We didn't lead it. Governors and state school chief officers led it. But no one in this country, no one 2.5 years ago would have predicted that 45 states were going to raise standards. This is an absolute game changer. And for the first time in this country, a child here in Michigan, or a child in Mississippi, or a child in Massachusetts is being measured by the same yardstick and held to that same high standards. That's an amazing, amazing breakthrough in a short amount of time. This is supposed to be the third rail that happened. But whether it's charter networks, whether it's Common Core, our resources race to the top, invest in innovation, teacher incentive funds, all of our resources should be going to taking to scale and replicating what's working. For all the challenges we faced, they're all being solved somewhere in this country. Somewhere people are doing amazing, amazing work, closing these gaps. What we haven't done in education is take to scale what works. That's the business that I think we should be in. I think that's the appropriate federal role, not compliance, not bureaucracy, not overreach.
Real quickly, I want to pick up on the how do we recruit talented minority individuals into education. And I think part of what's happened today is part of what has to go on. The public discourse about education has got to change because talented women and talented minorities have many more choices, and education cannot be looking terribly attractive when there are public calls to reduce teacher salaries, when teachers are operating with so many vagaries and constraints. So I think that we're obliged to get out there and tell the stories of the successes and the efforts that we've all been talking about.
If I can add to that, just an example of something I had the experience of working with in another district. We saw that we had a problem trying to find and attract and retain quality minority candidates for our teaching positions, and we were going, all throughout the state and the country recruiting. But one of the things that we did, and I'd like to see more of replicated, I guess, throughout the country, is we developed a Grow Your Own program. Just last night, I was having a conversation with a gentleman who's a paraprofessional in my school district who, when you walk into the buildings, the teachers know it, the kids know it. Absolutely, if there's a problem, he has respect of the students. This gentleman would love to be a teacher, but he's working full-time in the day, and he's also working in the evening. But individuals like that, they're in our community, and when we created the space to, and we actually put the resources to send 2 or 3 in our district to school, when they came back and they finished, they already had an invested interest in that community. And a lot of times when you're trying to cultivate minority talent, what happens is, because there's so few of them, they go to the highest bidder. So if we really want to do something different that changes the game, we have to sometimes think outside of the box and starting them off at a community college, taking them to a university. But these are people who are already invested in our system, who are working at the lowest pay levels in our system, who care for our kids, care for our communities. So they have the relevancy, they have the relationships. Now we just need to work with them to get them the pedagogy so that they can be in front of our students in another level, because the respect is already there, and those kids walk through walls for these individuals, and we know them.
It would also help to make teaching a more attractive occupation, better working conditions, better salaries in many places. There are lots of teachers in this country who don't have time to go to the John during the day because the work is so badly designed.
As we go forward, and you talked about, Deborah, 1 million new teachers, we're going to need a third of the workforce. Thinking through how we do this is desperately important for the next 30 years for the country. It's a once-in-a-generation shift. So I've been on many issues, including some a little bit controversial. I've talked about the need to double starting salaries for teachers and start out at 60, 65 and have great teachers make 130, 140, 150. And we're trying to do a lot of economic balancing. This is a tough thing to ask for in a time of declining resources, but can we spend differently? Can we think about investments we're making that aren't making a difference? And no one goes into education to make $1 million, but there are lots of folks who leave when they want to start a family or own their own home. There are many folks who don't come in because they don't like the value proposition. And I'm out across the country trying to recruit the next generation of talent, and a lot of them worry about pay. But if I can look them in the eye and say, if you're not 55, but if you're 28, 29, 30, and you're doing an amazing job, you can make $100,000, the room gets real quiet. You get people's attention. And so we're not there yet, but I'd urge folks here to think about how we raise salaries, how we change working conditions, how we think differently about time. There have to be some trade-offs here, longer days, longer weeks, longer years. But the value proposition that we're offering to this next generation, I think doesn't work. And they have too many other options. Lots of folks want to do this in their heart, but they just have another opportunity. And for me, it's how do we elevate teaching so it's doctors, lawyers, engineers, and teachers. And right now, we've beaten down educators, we've beaten down teachers. And for us to get where we need to go as a country, we need to not tinker around the edges. We need to take a quantum leap. And the collective thoughts and wisdom of folks here, we need to do this again in a pretty quick order, pretty short order.
Okay, one last comment, David, but there are lots of people here who want to talk, so go ahead.
You're absolutely right, Arne, and I really mean the applause. My youngest daughter, who will be 50 in another year, has worked in tough neighborhoods in Chicago teaching since she graduated from her teacher education after college. She now makes twice the poverty level.
Okay.
That's appalling. I mean, she's a very committed person, a really great teacher, and she makes twice the poverty level.
So we've covered a lot of issues here. They do seem to keep coming back to questions about the skill of people who work in classrooms and getting people who are committed and supporting them, and issues about how to think about who it is that we're getting to work on education, and many, many issues, but I know many of you actually hoped to pose some questions.
I know, Arne, that's crazy to me, Secretary. I know that you're really familiar with the Charter School Network, KIPP, and I am really familiar with them too. I love KIPP schools, and I've spent a lot of time in the different schools around the country, and I know that part of what you're trying to do with education in our country is to replicate the sorts of successes, the achievement gap closing stuff that KIPP is doing. And I guess what I'm wondering is if any of you guys are familiar with the recent study that came out in March from Western Michigan that was one of the few critical studies of KIPP that I've seen. But basically it was talking about how 40% of their African American boy students drop out, about how they actually spend more money than the comparison districts. And it seems like perhaps they're really struggling in their efforts to scale up dramatically, which is obviously what we need to do to make a difference. And I'm just wondering if, like, A, you thought that was a real problem, or that there's perhaps problems with methodology, but if you do think that's a problem, what are some ways to address these issues of scaling up?
So I think overall, KIPP is not the perfect answer. There is no perfect answer. They haven't figured this out, but they've done as well or better than anybody else. So I think there's lots of positive lessons there, and they'd be the first to say they're not over there. What have they done pretty systemically? They use time very differently. They just work more hours, and it's amazing to me that, you know, our calendar is based upon the agrarian economy. Our kids aren't working in the fields anymore, and somehow we've been reluctant to change. And, you know, so many of our children from disadvantaged communities, summer is not a time of great learning. Summer is a time of loss. I don't need another academic study on that. What I need is a lot more people giving enrichment during the summer so kids come back in September not further behind than when they left in June. KIPP has brought in great talent, and there's challenges in retaining that talent and how hard they're working, but they've brought in people of amazing commitment who will go through walls. And then for me, it's just sort of about culture and expectations, that they're just expecting kids to do well. So I think those are lessons that can be replicated. There's nothing unique to what KIPP is doing. They're still struggling to get some things right and haven't done things perfectly. But I think there's a lot of just common sense there that would be silly not to learn from. What's interesting to me is, we talk about replicating charter networks. KIPP has done probably as good a job as anybody. They've been at it, I think, about 20 years, and I think they have about 100 schools. So on one hand, that's great. On the other hand, 100 schools in 20 years is not systemic change. So how we not just help them replicate faster, but how districts start to employ some of those lessons and think about talent differently and time differently and expectations differently. That's where I think we haven't been nimble enough.
I'm Mary Marshall. I'm the superintendent of Dexter Community Schools just west of Ann Arbor here. It's great to be here and to hear all of you. You've provoked so much thought for me. I appreciate it. I guess from my experience, I'd like to know what we can do to support teachers in their first 5 years in the profession, because we can train them, and I think everything you said about training teachers is exceptionally relevant. But once we get into a system that's been in place and rolling for 100 years here, you know, I have personally heard people say, forget everything you learned in school, let me show you how to do it. So how do we support teachers in those first 5 formative years where we know the majority of teachers who are not going to stay in the profession begin to leave?
Did it?
Well, I guess I'll take a stab at it. You know, one of the things that I was trying to make the example of earlier is that is a real problem. And when I was a principal in a school, we had a high turnover of teachers. We had a high number of low-income minority students. And so we had to say for our teachers, we want to pair you with teachers who are doing a good job based on the results, and we want to continually work and cultivate and model. Here's my best couple math teachers, you need to work with them. Here's my best teachers in this area, because what I started to see is, you know, not only is the pay not where it needs to be, but if they start experiencing an inordinate amount of challenges in those first couple years, it's a wash. You know you're going to lose them. And so, you know, how the universities and the schools can find better ways to support them through the first 5 years, I'm not quite sure we have solved that at a national level or at all, but you know, certainly if we could have more support in those areas, it's critical.
Deborah, let me take a quick comment to that. You know, I wonder what would happen if Dexter would partner, for example, with us, because we have interesting problems. We want to pick good mentor teachers for our students to work with. We also want, like med schools, you know, the people become interns and then residents, so their education doesn't end the moment they leave our clinical campuses. So what would happen if we were to partner with Dexter to do those kinds of things? Your teachers need CEUs. They can get them in all kinds of ways, right? There's all kinds of people brokering these kinds of professional things that the state says teachers need to get recertified. So what if we partnered that way so that teachers in the first 5 years would be continuing their education, an extension of what we're doing, and then we'd be also mentoring your teachers to become better teacher leaders. We'd be learning a lot from those kinds of practices.
This woman right here, Ellen, can you give her the mic?
Well, it's afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Lois Lofton Donover, and I'm from the American Federation of Teachers. And I just like to tag along with what the teacher talking about, the beginning teachers, 5 years. But what I see is our senior teachers. They need that continuing support, and we seem to kind of forget that. And I'd like to know, what are we going to do to continue supporting that practitioner in the classroom? Thank you.
Let me just state why I think that's so important. This move to these higher standards is a major breakthrough, but if we don't help teachers understand what that means, this is a paper exercise. And I think one of the things that we do most poorly as a country is ongoing professional development and better support, helping teachers understand how to hit these higher bars, what that actually means in a first grade classroom, in a fifth grade classroom, in an eighth grade classroom every single day. There's going to be a massive amount of training and retraining that needs to happen. We spend probably not enough money in this area, but I promise you the money we're spending today is not well spent. And when I go out and talk to teachers and say, do you have any guess how much we spend at the federal government on professional development? I get a bunch of guesses. In the United States, it's $2.5 billion. Teachers either laugh or they cry. And I say, how many of you are feeling you're getting your craft improved and your practice improved thanks to our investment? And very few hands go up. So I challenge all of us to think about how we make that ongoing professional development, whether it's for the first 5 years or the last 5 years, a heck of a lot more meaningful, less conferences in convention centers and hotels, a lot more in the classroom with mentor and master teachers, the videos, they're really evaluating, I call it deprivatizing public education, opening up classrooms, having teachers really understand what's working and not, and getting good feedback from their peers. I think we have so far to go as a country in this area.
I want to just say again on behalf of all of us in the community how much we appreciate your coming today, Arne, because as I said at the beginning, our effort to redefine what schools of ed can contribute to the sorts of issues we've been talking about is really driving us these days, and we're really committed, and having the opportunity to both bring these kind of multiple communities together here to talk about it and have you here showing that the kind of work that we're going to do together is going to be really crucial. I think you said it very well, so thank you so much for making sure this was a stop on your bus tour. And we have a small gift to present to you. Arne was, for a while, a professional basketball player in Australia.
A long time ago.
And likes to play basketball a lot. So we arranged to equip you. Turn it around.
Oh, wow. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.